begin to examine how to create variables in Python by learning about an essential component, the identifier. A variable is a memory location that's inside the computer and it has an associated name. We use this name to reference that particular memory location where we've stored a value. We need to have a name for the location because the computer's memory is kind of like a lot of little cubby holes. I think of it like an ice cube tray, where each of the different slots in the ice cube tray pretty much looks identical. So it's hard to tell the difference between one slot in the tray and another slot in the tray. It's hard for us to give directions about where to retrieve information. You can imagine that if you took a little Post-it note and you put it into one of these slots, and then you wanted to tell your friend how to retrieve that information, it'd be like kind of challenging to describe where to look, especially if all of these different spaces in the tray were all filled up with little Post-it notes. It'd be hard to distinguish which slot contains your Post-it note versus which slot contains other data. So we need a way to tell the computer where to look for the information that we're storing. Now, we've talked before about how the computer tends to think differently than we do. Computer is an electronic device, and so it tends to think in terms of numeric values or things that can be stored in electronic circuits. And so the computer would like to think of all these little spaces in the computer's memory as each being a numeric value, kind of like a street address. We could probably use that kind of reference system if we had a limited number of storage spaces. You can imagine if you just had one ice cube tray and you wanted to create a scheme where maybe the first box was numbered 1 and the second box over was numbered 2 and so on. You went down the first row for the 7 spaces that are there, and then you started with number 8 in the second row and so on. That would work pretty well if we had a limited number of spaces. But computer memory has thousands and thousands and thousands of spaces, and it would be hard for us mentally to keep track of all those different numbers. As human beings, we are not awesome at remembering really long sequences of numbers. So we need a way of communicating more effectively with the computer. The computer's preference is to use a numeric value to reference a memory space, but as human beings, we typically like to use words or text to describe the meaning behind the information that we're storing. And that's exactly what an identifier is. An identifier is a name that we give to a memory location so that we associate the purpose of that data that we're storing with that particular memory location. And the computer has a way of associating our name that we provide to the variable with an actual numeric value. So it keeps a little like a lookup chart so that it can say, oh, you've created an identifier that stores your first name. That's stored in memory cell 1672. Then we as human beings don't have to remember that long number, 1672. We just have to remember I created a variable that stores information about my first name. Today we're going to look at some examples of different variables, and remember that it's important to think of the meaning that we want to give to that particular variable name. A good variable name is always descriptive and describes the purpose or the meaning behind the data that we're storing. I'm going to load up the idle editor so that I can demonstrate the syntax for creating variables live in Python, and you can see how it reacts to the code that I'm typing in. Remember, to start Python, I'm on a Mac, and so I go to my applications area in a Finder window, and then to start Python, I want to click on the idle application. And remember, we can either use Python directly in this editor window, or we can create a file. For today, we're just going to be trying out some code, so I'm not going to bother with a file. The things that we're going to be doing in our examples aren't things that I'm going to want to share with somebody else or save as a file so that I can email them or submit them to Canvas. So I don't need to keep a record of everything I'm typing. I'm just going to type directly into the Python interpreter. All right, so suppose we have some programs that we're trying to write and we want to create some variables. Suppose that we want to store the value 3.1415 in a memory location so that we can use it in some geometric formulas. You might remember from geometry that that particular number has some important implications for circles and other values. And so we might want to store that in our program so that we could conveniently use it in some formulas that we're trying to use. We'd find it natural to refer to that type of memory location with a name that captures the meaning of this value, 3.1415. And you might remember from math classes in your past that that particular value represents a constant called pi. And so we could create a variable called pi that stores that value, 3.1415. And to create that variable, you just type in the name of the identifier, and then we're using the assignment operator, which looks like an equal sign. And then we're saying this is the value that we want to store there. And Python responds by just returning the prompt. Notice it doesn't do anything or print anything about pi, but rest assured it has now created a memory location, and it's associated the name pi with that memory location, and it's storing our value 3.1415 in there. Let's look at a second example. Suppose we want to keep track of the name of our university so that we can display it on web pages and documents and use it in all kinds of communications that we're doing. We could create a variable called uname to store that value. Remember, to make the variable name, you just list the name of the identifier, so uname in this case. And then because we want to assign it a value, we're going to use the assignment operator. And now we want to type in the text for our university's name. Because it's a sequence of characters, we're going to put double quotes around it. That's a special Python rule. Anytime you're going to be storing text information rather than numeric data, use double quotes to delimit your text. So I'm going to type in, did I type in my example in the notes? University of Mary Washington. And you have to close out the double quotes. That's important. So Python knows that this is the end of the value that you want to store. So the double quote starts the value, and then the ending double quotes ends that particular text value. And again, Python doesn't do anything in response to you creating this variable, but rest assured it has now created a memory location and associated the name uname with that memory location. And inside there, it's storing this whole list of characters, University of Mary Washington. Let's do one more example. Suppose we want to keep track of the maximum number of times that something should repeat in our software that we're writing. We could create a variable that represents this maximum value. I'm going to call it maximum, and I want to assign it the value 10. And because 10 is a numeric value, I don't need any double quotes. You only need the quotes when you're using text data. So the name of my variable is maximum, and I'm assigning the value 10 to that particular variable, and the computer will store the value 10 in a memory location associated with the name maximum. So you can try out these examples in Python, and you can just type along. Remember, don't expect it to do anything in response. It doesn't show you that it's created the variable, but trust me, it has stored the information. Let's look at some rules for creating valid identifiers. Everything that we've used in our example is a valid identifier, and we can tell that because Python didn't produce any type of error messages when we created these variables. Python has a few rules about variable identifiers. The first rule is that your variable identifier has to begin with either a letter or an underscore. You see that in all of our examples, we started with a character. So that was a valid letter. So those were all valid identifiers. If we try to create an identifier, like maybe when we want to store my first name, so we type in one name equals Karen. Python tells us, hey, that's invalid syntax. That's because I didn't start this particular variable identifier with a character. I started it with a number, and Python doesn't allow that. Another rule is that your identifier can't include spaces or dashes. Let's try out an example where we do that. If we do something like first name equals Karen. Python's not smart enough to realize that you contextually want these two words to go together and be a single variable name. So it's going to get confused whenever I execute that statement. So it tells us that's invalid syntax, and it flags the character that's right after the space, because that's the part where it detects that there's a problem. It's just like, hey, I was expecting you to have an equal sign or something else here, but instead I found another word. I'm not sure what you mean. And so you just need to look at Python in those cases and try to figure out like what you typed that might be confusing to Python. Another rule is that after you have your first character, the identifier can include any combination of letters, underscores, and numbers. So if I wanted to write name1 equals Karen, Python would be totally cool with that because the 1 isn't the first character in the name. It says, hey, that's okay. And then finally, the last rule about variable identifiers is that you can't use certain reserved words that are part of the Python commands. And there's a list of these here in your notes just for quick reference. They're probably things that you wouldn't use as variable names anyway, but just in case sometime you're trying to declare something and I don't know, you put a word like global equals space, it'll tell us, hey, that's invalid syntax. That's because the word global is one of those reserved words. And you can tell that it highlights it a different color. So you know that it's a special word in Python and that you can't use that as a variable identifier. So those are the 4 essential rules. If you violate those rules, Python will not allow you to run your software. You have to make sure your identifier begins with a letter or the underscore symbol. It can't have any spaces or dashes. You are allowed to have letters, underscores, and numbers later on after that first character in the word. And there's certain words that you can't use because they're reserved for other purposes in the Python language. If you violate any of those rules, then Python won't allow you to execute your software. Now, beyond just the rules of Python, there's some rules that are good as a programmer. A lot of times when we're writing software, we're not writing software in isolation. We're writing it with a team of people. And so we want to be able to communicate information about the identifiers and the variables that we're using in a way that's meaningful to others. And so whenever you're creating software in Python, you want to create a variable name that's descriptive, that explains the purpose of the variable that you're creating. So for example, in the Python code that we wrote earlier, where we created the variables pi, uname, and maximum, those are all great identifiers. They're not the only identifiers you could use for those variables. Certainly for a uname, you could have used university name or name of college or something like that. For maximum, maybe you wouldn't want to write out the whole word maximum. You'd just write max, or maybe you would write maximum repetitions or something like that to be even more descriptive. All of those are great choices. They're all descriptive. Let's think back to the identifiers in our chaos program. I'm going to go back to that just in case it's not kind of at the forefront of your memory. Let's look at this example program. Remember that there's 2 variables in here, x and I. What do you think? Do you think those are descriptive variables? Do they help you understand what this program does? I'd say no. Just looking at this program and the values x and I, it's unclear what the purpose of those 2 variables are. So those aren't great examples of Python identifiers. You would want to do something better than that if you were creating the chaos program. Another thing to remember when you're creating identifiers is that there's no spell check in the Python editor. So for example, if you type in university name equals UMW, and you spell it wrong, and then later on you say, hey, I want to print out the university name, Python's going to say, hey, I don't know what you're talking about, because it doesn't realize that you incorrectly spelled university name and that now you've corrected that spelling. It doesn't realize that you want these 2 words to refer to the same memory location. So you have to be really careful whenever you're spelling identifiers in Python. It's really easy to mistype something, or anytime you do that, Python will give you an error message saying that your variable name, whatever you typed, is not defined. And that means it can't find where you declared that variable or where you created that variable in your software. Hey, so our example notes have some additional problems for us to work through. Let's restart our Python editor and work through those examples. I'm restarting idle, so I have a fresh start. All right, so I'm going to declare this variable uname, capital U, and set it equal to University of Mary Washington. And now, suppose I say I want to display the contents of the variable uname, but I make it all lowercase. Do you think that Python's going to be smart enough to know that that's the name of our university? No, it definitely isn't. Python is case sensitive, which means that if you capitalize something, you have to always capitalize it. It won't associate the same sequence of characters with a lowercase value with that first uppercase version that you created. So you have to make sure you spell them exactly the same. How about if you type in umain instead of uname? Do you think it'll know that they're connected? No, it's definitely not that smart. So it doesn't realize that the M is very close to the N on the keyboard, and maybe you just pressed the wrong key. And it's not as smart as, say, a Google search or something where you might mistype something and it would offer suggestions or how to correct them. It just tells you, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. That particular variable, uname, is not defined. So anytime you get a message like that, just make sure you look back at the characters that you typed in carefully and see if there's any of them that are mistyped. How about if we make it all capital? If you guessed that doesn't work either, you are absolutely correct. The only way that we can print out that value that we stored in capital U, lowercase n, lowercase a, lowercase m, lowercase e is if we type it exactly the same way that we typed it originally. When we ask it to display that value, it'll retrieve the contents of that memory location and print out the data that we stored there. So remember that variables are case sensitive, so the capitalization matters, as does the spelling. So we've talked a little bit about the rules that Python enforces for identifiers, and we've also talked about the need to make descriptive identifiers so it's easy to communicate the meaning of our variables to others that we might be collaborating with on software. Let's look at this list of sample identifiers and see if you can pick which ones are valid. Remember, it's valid if it follows Python's rules. And then also think about which ones are descriptive, which ones would be good to use in a program. Pause the video for a second and then we'll come back and check your answers. So first, let's think about which ones are valid. So S, capital S, that's valid. Sum with a capital S, that's also valid. Name, that's valid. First name, where the first name starts with a 1, that's not valid because remember, identifiers have to start with a character, a letter, not a numeric value. If we spelled out first name, that would be a valid identifier. And first underscore name, that's also valid. Which of these would you consider to be descriptive identifiers? I would consider them all to be descriptive, except probably the very first one, the just individual S. That one wouldn't be descriptive because it's unclear what the S stands for. Maybe it stands for some, maybe it stands for sunny days, maybe it stands for Sunday. It's unclear. We can't really tell the meaning or purpose of that variable. Some name, first name, some name, first name all spelled out, and first underscore name. Those are all great choices for a variable. I'm going to put a big X through the first name. Remember, that's the one that's not valid. And then I'm also going to, or I'll highlight the ones that are good. That's what I'll do. So we wouldn't want to use the capital S because it's not descriptive. It would compile and Python would be happy to allow you to use it. It just wouldn't be a great choice if you were collaborating with other people. Sum and name are great choices and both valid. First name that starts with a 1 is not valid because it doesn't start with a letter. And first name and first underscore name, those are both valid and descriptive. So they're great choices. During the semester, we're going to get lots of practice in picking descriptive, valid identifiers as we create variables in our software.